What if I told you that the face of Stoic wisdom, the man who preached self-control, virtue, and inner peace, had a life filled with war, betrayal, family drama, and sleepless nights? Marcus Aurelius wasn't sipping herbal tea under a tree while writing Meditations. He was dodging arrows, enduring plagues, and trying to figure out why his son thought being a decent human was optional. Stoicism didn't come to him because life was easy. It came because it wasn't. And that's what makes his philosophy powerful. But today, we're not just going to praise him. We're diving into the darker truths he lived through. Before we go deeper, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to support our Stoic journey. And make sure you watch till the end, because trust me, what you're about to learn will change how you see Marcus forever. Number 1, a throne he never wanted, the weight of power. Marcus Aurelius wasn't born power-hungry. He didn't dream of wearing a crown or commanding armies. He was a quiet philosopher at heart, more interested in books than politics. But life had other plans. When Emperor Antoninus Pius adopted him, Marcus was thrust into the line of succession. Imagine being a bookworm who suddenly has to manage a crumbling empire. Not exactly a promotion you celebrate with cake. Power might sound glamorous, but for Marcus, it came with crushing responsibility. The Roman Empire was a mess, economically, politically, militarily. He had to lead not just with reason, but with grit, making tough decisions that often went against his nature. That constant tension between his Stoic ideals and the brutal demands of ruling was a daily struggle. He didn't even rule alone at first. Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, shared the throne. Sounds nice, until you realize Verus partied while Marcus cleaned up the mess. Marcus tried to keep the empire together while Lucius drank wine like it was water. Some historians say Marcus did the work of 2 emperors while Verus perfected the art of delegation to Marcus. Stoicism teaches acceptance of your role, no matter how hard. Marcus embodied that. But deep down, you can sense his frustration in Meditations. He never wanted to be emperor. He wanted to live in accordance with nature, his nature. Yet, he bore the crown like a burden, not a prize. Number 2, war, plague, and misery, a reign of chaos. You know how some people complain that their job is stressful? Marcus Aurelius had to deal with one of the worst pandemics in ancient history and constant warfare on multiple fronts. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, wiped out millions, including some of his closest allies. Imagine trying to write Stoic wisdom while coughing up a lung and wondering if your army has enough troops left to stand. He spent nearly half of his reign on the battlefield, not in a palace. His tents were libraries by night and command centers by day. Meditations wasn't written on vacation. It was composed in cold military camps, with enemies literally at the gates. Ever tried journaling with one hand while holding a sword in the other? And these weren't short wars. The Marcomannic Wars lasted over a decade. It was a brutal, exhausting campaign against Germanic tribes. Marcus saw his generals fall, his soldiers die, and his enemies grow bolder. Yet, through it all, he maintained his composure, or at least tried to. His writings hint at a man constantly trying to control the inner storm while the outer world burned. Even when the plague hit Rome, instead of fleeing, Marcus stayed. He sold palace treasures to fund relief efforts. That's like selling your Ferrari to buy masks and hand sanitizers for your city. Noble? Yes, but also heartbreaking. It wore him down, physically and emotionally. The plague didn't just infect bodies. It corroded the empire he tried so hard to hold together. Number 3, family woes. The emperor and the disappointment. Let's talk about the elephant in the Roman Forum, his son Commodus. If Marcus Aurelius was the Jedi master of philosophy, Commodus was the Sith lord of bad decisions. Spoiled, vain, and reckless, Commodus undid much of his father's legacy within a few years. The man actually thought he was Hercules and wanted to rename Rome after himself. You can't make this up. Historians have long debated why Marcus, of all people, handed the empire to Commodus. Some say it was due to tradition. Others think Marcus believed too much in nurture over nature. But whatever the reason, it was a Stoic tragedy. Commodus represented everything Marcus tried to avoid: ego, vanity, cruelty, and unchecked indulgence. Imagine dedicating your life to virtue and reason, only to pass the torch to someone who lights it on fire for fun. It must have tormented Marcus in his final days. His dream of a noble, just Rome died with him. Stoicism teaches us not to get too attached to outcomes. But let's be honest, Marcus probably died with a broken heart and a worried brow. And there's more. His wife, Faustina, is rumored to have been unfaithful, possibly even conspiring against him. Whether that's true or not, the whispers alone were enough to fuel his inner conflict. He endured betrayal not just from politicians or generals, but possibly from his own family. For a man who believed in inner peace, his home life was a storm. Number 4. The loneliness of virtue, a philosopher among politicians. In a world driven by ambition, manipulation, and power grabs, Marcus was the odd one out. He wasn't greedy, didn't indulge in excessive pleasures, and avoided flattery like it was the plague. Though unfortunately, he couldn't avoid the actual plague. His commitment to virtue often made him an outsider in his own court. He often wrote about feeling misunderstood and isolated. His values clashed with those of Rome's elite. While senators schemed for power, Marcus wrote about death, humility, and the fleeting nature of fame. It's like putting a monk in charge of a Las Vegas casino. His worldview wasn't just different, it was radically countercultural. That kind of moral integrity is admirable, but also lonely. Stoicism gave Marcus clarity, but it didn't give him friends. Many of the people around him didn't share his values. Even his mentors, like Junius Rusticus, were exceptions in a city full of excess. Marcus had to remind himself daily, do not expect the world to be just if you are. His introspection became his only refuge. The darker side of being virtuous is that sometimes you walk alone. Marcus endured that loneliness with dignity, but you can feel the weight of it in his writing. It's the kind of loneliness that ages you faster than war ever could. Number 5, death, regret, and the final lessons. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, likely from a plague. His final days were quiet but heavy. He knew he was dying. He also knew what and who he was leaving behind. His final writings reflect a man trying to find peace with impermanence, but you can read between the lines. There was sorrow, there was doubt. He once wrote, "Soon you will have forgotten everything. Soon everything will have forgotten you." That's not just stoicism, it's grief in disguise. Despite all his efforts, his empire was fragile. His son was unfit. His legacy, uncertain. Stoicism helped him cope, but it didn't erase the pain. What makes Marcus powerful isn't that he was perfect. It's that he practiced what he preached, even when life gave him every reason not to. He accepted suffering with grace, failure with humility, and death with courage. His life was messy, painful, and complicated, and that's why his philosophy still resonates today. So if you've ever felt like life is chaotic, people are disappointing, and the world doesn't match your ideals, congratulations. You're in great company. Marcus was there too, and he turned that darkness into wisdom. Number 6, the philosophy of pain, battling chronic illness. Behind Marcus Aurelius' composed demeanor was a man suffering from chronic illness for much of his adult life. Though we don't know exactly what plagued him, many scholars believe he endured severe stomach issues, arthritis, and debilitating fatigue. His physical condition was so fragile that some Roman physicians documented his regular need for medical care. Think daily aches, not occasional sniffles. Imagine being the ruler of the largest empire on earth, commanding legions and managing crises, while your own body feels like it's turning against you. That takes more than strength. It takes relentless discipline. His Stoicism wasn't just philosophical fluff. It was a coping mechanism for a man who had to pretend to be invincible while constantly in pain. You can see the struggle in Meditations, where he often reminds himself not to let the body dictate the mind. He viewed pain as something external, something that could be endured, even ignored. But let's be real, when your joints are burning and your stomach's in knots, virtue sounds a lot less poetic. He practiced attachment because his body gave him no choice. The dark truth? His resilience came from necessity, not luxury. Stoicism wasn't just a hobby for Marcus, it was medicine. And in a world without painkillers, sometimes philosophy was the only thing standing between him and despair. Number 7. Betrayals in the Senate, trusting the untrustworthy. While Marcus Aurelius strove to be fair, rational, and morally upright, the Roman Senate was often a cesspool of jealousy, backstabbing, and political theater. Many senators resented his calm authority. Others saw his restraint as weakness. Even in a toga, snakes still slithered. Marcus believed in the Stoic principle of cooperation with others, but in politics, that's easier said than done. He tried to rule as a philosopher king. But what do you do when everyone around you is auditioning for the role of Brutus? The Senate was filled with men who praised him in public, but plotted in private. Even during times of war and plague, Marcus had to worry about internal enemies, men more interested in climbing ladders than saving Rome. He pardoned many traitors and conspirators out of mercy, believing in reform. Some saw this as virtue. Others saw it as naivety. But Stoicism taught him to act according to reason, not revenge. Still, it's hard not to imagine him quietly fuming at night, thinking, why do I keep giving second chances to people who'd sell me for a coin and a goat? But such was his character. Even when surrounded by corruption, he stayed principled, choosing personal integrity over political convenience. Number 8. Philosophical hypocrisy, Stoic ideal versus human emotion. It's easy to put Marcus Aurelius on a pedestal. He literally sat on one in most statues. But the reality is, he sometimes fell short of his own teachings. He wrote often about suppressing anger, detaching from desires, and not letting emotions control him. Yet, there are instances suggesting he didn't always succeed. There were executions under his rule, both political and military. He approved brutal actions during rebellions, and even though he may have justified them as necessary, they contradict the ideal Stoic calm he wrote about. After all, Stoicism isn't about endorsing cruelty for the greater good. It's about maintaining virtue in all circumstances. There's also his family decisions. Appointing Commodus, despite clear signs of incompetence, clashes with his principle of rational leadership. Was it emotional attachment? Was it pressure? Either way, it wasn't a Stoic masterstroke. It was a very human decision from a man who preached non-attachment. And maybe that's the most relatable part, Marcus. He knew the right thing, tried to live by it, and sometimes failed, like all of us. But instead of quitting, he wrote through it. He reminded himself, and us, that falling short doesn't make you a hypocrite. It makes you human. Trying again is what makes you Stoic. Number 9, a heavy legacy, knowing it would all fade. One of the darkest elements of Marcus' reflections is his constant reminder that everything, his reign, his victories, his words, would be forgotten. He often pondered the futility of fame, legacy, and monuments. Most people find comfort in the idea that they'll be remembered. Marcus? He questioned if that even mattered. He'd write things like, Alexander the Great and his mule driver were both brought to the same place by death. That's not your average self-help affirmation. That's the existential version of we all end up 6 feet under. As emperor, you'd think he'd revel in the idea of his eternal impact. But no. He believed memory itself was fleeting and unreliable. And guess what? He wasn't wrong. His name faded for centuries. Meditations wasn't widely read until the Renaissance. For a while, Marcus was just another bust collecting dust in old libraries. Ironically, The man who said he wouldn't be remembered wasn't, not until much later. That kind of clarity, knowing your grandest achievements will likely fade, is deeply stoic, but also deeply depressing. And yet, he accepted it. He believed that the present moment, lived virtuously, was enough. Fame was just noise. Legacy a myth. All that mattered was now. Number 10. A stoic in an unstoic world. Constant resistance. Marcus Aurelius was like a candle in a hurricane. Every aspect of his world, Rome's decadence, military aggression, political power plays, even public entertainment, ran counter to the calm, reasoned, and self-disciplined life he tried to live. His existence was a non-stop philosophical resistance against everything around him. He lived in a time of brutal gladiator games, lavish feasts, and emperor-worshipping cults. While everyone else was partying like it was 99 AD, Marcus was journaling about mortality and virtue. His peers might have thought he was the buzzkill at every banquet. Marcus, lighten up. Try some peacock meat. No thanks, I'm meditating on death. Even religiously, he clashed with the growing Christian movement. Though often seen as tolerant, he presided over persecutions, perhaps out of political necessity. It was a difficult position, maintain Roman unity or honor freedom of belief. Again, not an easy choice for someone trying to do what's right in a world that only cared about what was expedient. That's what makes Marcus so fascinating. He wasn't stoic because the world supported it. He was stoic despite the world. His daily life was a philosophical battle. He was quite literally a philosopher at war, with enemies, with politics, with himself. And maybe, deep down, that's the most stoic thing of all. So when we talk about Marcus Aurelius, we shouldn't just remember the quotes or the statues. We should remember the man, sick, exhausted, disappointed, and alone, yet still showing up every day, doing what needed to be done. That's the kind of strength Stoicism is really about. Not perfection, but persistence. If this deeper look into Marcus' life gave you something to think about, or even laugh at, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Let's keep growing this channel, one Stoic truth at a time.